The murder of 35-year-old Michael Beaton, who was mowed down and then bladed in what was described as a highly charged, cowardly and vicious and wicked incident, was made that much worse when it was revealed that Michael had been killed in part by his own pal. On the evening of November 26th of 2023, at roughly 7:20 p.m, Michael Beaton and his pal Richard Mullan had banded together in order to chase down 27-year-old Alexander McQuilan. While Richard was behind the wheel of an Audi Q2 that had been stolen and then fitted with false plates, the 21-year-old had reached speeds of up to 60 miles per hour as he sped through 30 mile per hour zones. Now Michael had pursued Alexander on foot. Michael Beaton and Richard Mullan had been caught on CCTV, searching for Alexander McQuilan. However, things took a drastic turn when Alexander was spotted. Seeing his opportunity, Richard quickly changed gears and pressed acceleration pedal. He then sped up. In what can only be described as a colossal error, Richard had actually ploughed into his own friend, his feet leaving the ground. Distraught residents who were overcome with grief and were still crying of Drumforchar Road told police that they first heard the rev of an engine, quickly followed by tyres screeching and then the sound of a shrill scream, yells, as a car made contact with something. The witnesses could not comprehend that it was an actual person until they went to the scene themselves. The intended target was Alexander McQuilan, but Richard Mullan had ploughed into Michael Beaton. Not realising his mistake, Richard then drove the Audi Q2 straight towards Michael for a second time. Despite Michael already being injured, Michael had actually attempted to get to his feet and then make his way onto the pavement, but he was moving very, very slow and he could not get to the pavement in time, and that was when Richard Mullan had ploughed into Michael for a second time. His feet left the ground again and Michael travelled distance down the road before coming to a stop in the road, his arms and legs in all different directions. Now in the aftermath, Richard Mullan had fled the scene in the stolen car, and as he sped away, he actually made contact with a control box. This meant that Michael Beaton was all alone with Alexander McQuilan. Now in the meantime, as Michael Beaton lay seriously injured in the road in Inverclyde, Greenock, Alexander had lay hidden nearby, and he was equipped with a large blade, and he was about to use it. Skulking from his place of cover, Alexander McQuilan then walked over to Michael, who was already being surrounded by residents. Now Michael was not moving at all, and he had covered his injuries with his arms the best he could. Michael was now prey. He was gravely injured and he was laid in a fetal position, and that was when Alexander struck. According to witnesses, Alexander McQuilan had travelled over to Michael with other concerned residences, and they all tried to administer first aid. They actually thought that Alexander had come over to help too. However, Alexander just laughed. He laughed by saying, "Ha ha 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 ha," and then he began to taunt Michael, allegedly saying, "You'll not be doing something like that in a hurry." And in those few final moments of Michael Beaton's life, he would have saw Alexander raise a large blade over his head before bringing it back down again, quickly, rapidly. Now with so much discontent, hatred for Michael, Alexander had used the blade, jabbed face area multiple times and body. Now witnesses frantically called 999 and they tried to administer first aid as Alexander just laughed again, a man unhinged. He then had taken Michael's Ford car before parking in the car park briefly and then taking the car to his sister's house before settling back home. Michael Beaton was rushed to hospital where he underwent emergency surgery, but his wounds were described as multiple and catastrophic, a combination from being mowed down and also being bladed. Sadly, Michael Beaton was declared dead a little while later. Now, during the police investigation, police actually recovered CCTV with sound recordings that faintly recorded Alexander McQuilan's voice of him laughing, saying, "Ha ha ha, he just done his own palling." Now, the sad reality is this: Michael Beaton and Richard Mullan had got into an altercation earlier on in the day with Alexander McQuilan on November 26th. Richard Mullan did not want to let the situation go, and he had recruited Michael Beaton to help in the matter. So the two men went around Greenock hoping to find Alexander, hoping to trap the man in the pincer movement and either hurt Alexander or worse, decay him. No one would have been able to foresee that karma or luck, or bad luck for that matter, would have given Alexander a lifeline, and instead Michael Beaton would be mowed down by his own pal Richard Mullan, not once but twice, leaving Michael with broken bones, internal damage. And then, as Michael was being labelled as an easy target, all Alexander had to do was come out from his hiding place and then use his blade on the already injured victim. The thing that made the that much more devastating for the people of Greenock and the surrounding community was that they knew Michael Beaton, and it was said that Michael was only defending his friend. He had no real involvement with the previous altercation that took place, and that was repeated by the police. This was a case of mistaken identity. Now, with regards to the earlier altercation between Alexander McQuilan and Richard Mullan and Michael Beaton, it's never been revealed, and it probably won't. However, as both Richard Mullan and Alexander McQuilan were both known to the police, the two men were arrested and then charged with the separately. 21-year-old Richard Mullan had no choice but to admit to being behind the wheel of a light-coloured Audi Q2 fitted with false plates and then using the car to plough into his mate not once but twice and then fleeing the scene. Alexander McQuilan, whom had walked over to an already injured Michael Beaton, who lay curled up in a ball on the road, almost unmoving, while members of the community tried their best to save his life, and all for Alexander McQuilan to come through the crowd and then use his blade on Michael in full view of scared, shocked and panicked men and women. He pled guilty to using a blade and putting an end to Michael Beaton's life. Both men had now been remanded in custody until their sentencing is due to take place, which should be on December 12th of this year. Lord Cuby told Richard and Alexander both, "You have each accepted killing Michael Beaton in a shocking way, and that it was a grotesque twist Richard Mullan thought he had been driving at Alexander. There are no winners in these types of situations." Again, both men were self-serving, and they were not great people. With regards to Richard Mullan, after the incident, he actually left the country and he tried to hide out in Spain. When it came down to the facts initially, Richard Mullan did not want to take responsibility for his actions, and rather than go to the police and hand himself in, he waited for the police to conduct the investigation. It was only when people began to mention their names, both Richard Mullan and Alexander McQuilan, as being the men responsible of killing Michael Beaton, and of course there were two men being arrested, that's when Richard Mullan accepted his guilt. And remember, this is Michael Beaton's own friend. Let me know your thoughts on the case. Stay safe.